Honor, choice, and the turning point of the frontier. The sun rose slowly over the endless plains, casting long shadows across the dry, dusty land. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant fires from neighbors' hearths. On this vast frontier, life was simple but hard, and every day demanded strength, skill, and determination. James Callahan, a young rancher barely in his 20s, stood at the edge of his property watching his cattle graze. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of another long day filled with work, challenges, and decisions that could change his life forever. James had been raised on this land, like his father and grandfather before him. His family's ranch had been small, but it had survived storms, droughts, and the occasional rustler. He had learned early that the frontier did not forgive weakness or indecision. Every task, from mending fences to tending the animals, required care and effort. But James believed there was more to life than survival. There was a code to follow, a sense of honor that guided his choices. He had seen men cheat, steal, and break promises, and he had learned that such actions left scars far deeper than any wound from a gun or a fight. In his heart, he knew that true respect came from integrity, not power or fear. That morning, he saddled his horse, a sturdy chestnut named Dakota, and began the ride to check the far end of his property. The plains stretched endlessly, a patchwork of green and gold dotted with clusters of trees and the occasional rocky hill. As he rode, James reflected on the life he had chosen. He could have left the frontier, found work in a town, or joined the growing railroads that promised wealth and excitement. But he had chosen this life, the life of a rancher, because it demanded honesty, courage, and hard work. Here, on the open land, a man's character showed in every action. James's route took him near the edge of the neighboring ranch, owned by a man named Samuel Hayes. Samuel had been friendly once, sharing tools and trading livestock, but tensions had grown over the years. A dispute over land boundaries had left a bitter taste in both families' mouths. Samuel believed he had rights to a portion of land James's family had always considered theirs. Small arguments had erupted into heated words, and now there was a quiet tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. James hoped to avoid confrontation, but he knew the frontier often demanded that a man stand firm, even when it was difficult. As he reached the fence line, he noticed several cows had strayed toward Samuel's property. James felt a familiar knot of frustration in his stomach. The cattle were valuable, and losing them could hurt his family's livelihood. He rode closer, shouting gently, trying to guide them back. The cows hesitated, wary of the open space beyond the fence. James could see Samuel in the distance, watching with a cautious eye. There was an unspoken understanding. Each man measured the other's patience, strength, and sense of fairness. The frontier thrived on respect, but respect had to be earned. James guided the cattle back to the safety of his ranch, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Every day brought decisions that tested him. Should he confront Samuel about the boundary dispute? Should he leave the matter alone, hoping it would fade with time? The choice was not simple. On one hand, defending the land was about honor and justice. On the other hand, confrontation could lead to violence or ruin long-standing neighborly ties. James knew that one wrong decision could ripple through the community, affecting not just him but his family and neighbors as well. He dismounted near the barn, loosening the saddle and brushing Dakota carefully. The horse nickered softly, sensing the tension in its rider. James paused, taking a moment to breathe. The ranch was his life, but it was more than that. It was a part of his family's legacy, a piece of the frontier that had been shaped by generations before him. He felt a deep connection to the land, a responsibility that went beyond himself. His father had always said, "A man is known by how he treats his land, his neighbors, and his word." James carried those words with him, a compass guiding his actions even when choices were difficult. Later that day he rode to the small town nearby, a cluster of wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a post office that also served as a gathering place for news and gossip. Frontier towns were rare havens where people could trade goods, share stories, and seek advice. James tied Dakota outside the store and stepped inside, nodding to familiar faces. He was greeted warmly, but he could sense the underlying tension among the men gathered by the fireplace. News traveled quickly here, and every minor dispute on the plains became a tale that shaped reputations and alliances. James listened carefully, picking up details about the weather, livestock prices, and the subtle currents of rivalry that flowed through the community. A few men discussed the boundary dispute between James and Samuel, their voices low but insistent. James remained calm, observing and listening. He understood that every word spoken in the town added weight to his decisions. Honor was not only about personal integrity, it was also about how others perceived a man's character. He could not act rashly, but he could not ignore the challenge either. The frontier demanded balance, courage, and thoughtfulness in equal measure. Returning home as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, James reflected on the day's events. The plains glowed in the golden light, shadows stretching long and thin. He rode slowly, letting Dakota graze as they approached the barn. He thought of his family, waiting for him with supper and stories of their own day's work. The sense of belonging, the ties of family, and the love for the land filled him with determination. He understood that the frontier was not merely a place, it was a test of character, a proving ground for decisions that would define a man's life. That evening, after the chores were done, James sat on the porch, looking out over the plains. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying memories of past struggles and lessons learned. He thought of the choices he had made and those he would have to face. Each day on the frontier offered a chance to demonstrate honor, to make a choice that reflected one's values, and to prepare for the turning points that inevitably came. Life was hard, but it was honest, and James knew that the rewards were measured not in wealth, but in respect, trust, and the satisfaction of doing what was right. As darkness settled over the land, stars began to fill the sky, shining brilliantly over the vast expanse. James felt a quiet sense of peace, even though challenges awaited. He knew that the frontier would test him, that difficult choices would come, and that every action mattered. But he also knew that he was ready. His hands were calloused from work, his heart steady from experience, and his mind clear with purpose. Honor and choice would guide him, and he was determined to meet the turning point of his life with courage, wisdom, and the unwavering sense of duty that had shaped him from boyhood. The night air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of coyotes and the gentle rustle of prairie grass. James remained on the porch for a long while, watching the stars and reflecting on the vastness of the world he lived in. Every day on the frontier was a story in itself, filled with decisions that mattered, risks that shaped character, and moments that tested a man's courage. He understood that life here demanded more than strength. It demanded integrity, compassion, and a clear mind. And as he finally went inside, he felt a quiet confidence that whatever challenges awaited, he would face them with honor, guided by the choices he believed were right. The next morning, James woke before dawn, as was his habit. The frontier demanded early hours and careful planning. Every day could bring unexpected challenges, and being unprepared often meant disaster. He dressed quickly, donning a worn shirt and sturdy trousers, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The plain stretched before him, calm, yet full of silent threats. Wind swept across the land, and the distant hills glowed with the first light of day. There was a certain beauty to the frontier, but also a constant reminder of its unforgiving nature. James's mind was heavy with thoughts of Samuel Hayes. The dispute over land boundaries had lingered too long. Samuel was not a man to back down easily, and the rumors of his anger had reached James even in the quiet of his ranch. While James preferred peace, he knew there were times when a man had to stand firm to protect what was rightfully his. The thought of confrontation was unpleasant, but he could not ignore the problem. The frontier did not reward hesitation. A single wrong step could jeopardize his family's future and their place in the community. James saddled Dakota and rode toward the disputed land, his heart steady, but his thoughts focused. He approached the boundary line cautiously, scanning the land for signs of trouble. As he neared the fence that separated their properties, he spotted Samuel working near his own barn, hammering a post into the ground. Samuel looked up and saw James at the edge of his land. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to the two of them. Neither spoke. Words could be dangerous, but silence, too, carried meaning. James dismounted and walked Dakota toward the fence, keeping his posture calm and non-threatening. He called out to Samuel, his voice firm but respectful. "Morning, Samuel." "I wanted to talk about the boundary line." Samuel straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "I figured you'd show up sooner or later," he said, his tone guarded. "I'm just making sure my fence is where it belongs. Don't want any trouble." James nodded. "Neither do I. But we need to settle this before it gets worse. It's better for both our families." The conversation was tense, filled with the weight of past disagreements and unspoken suspicion. Both men understood that their words carried consequences. On the frontier, disputes over land were more than simple disagreements. They could ignite violence, disrupt communities, and stain reputations. James took a deep breath and spoke carefully, explaining his family's perspective, the history of the land, and his wish to resolve the matter without conflict. Samuel listened, frowning, but there was a hint of consideration in his expression. He had always respected James's father, and he could see the same sense of honor in James. Yet pride and stubbornness were strong forces on the frontier, and Samuel was not a man easily persuaded. The two men continued to discuss measurements, landmarks, and the intentions of their families. Each word was chosen with care, each gesture observed. They were not only negotiating land, they were negotiating respect and trust. After several tense minutes, Samuel nodded reluctantly. "Maybe we can find a compromise." "I don't want to start a fight, but I can't give up what I believe is mine." James felt a sense of relief, but remained cautious. "I understand. Let's mark the line clearly so there's no misunderstanding. We can both live with it that way." The tension eased slightly, though both men knew the frontier was never completely predictable. With the boundary clarified, James rode back toward his ranch, feeling a mix of pride and concern. He had handled the situation with honor, as his father had taught him, but the experience reminded him how fragile peace could be. Life on the frontier required constant vigilance, courage, and the ability to make difficult choices under pressure. As he reached his barn, he found his younger brother Thomas waiting with a stack of firewood. Thomas was strong and eager, but still learning the ways of the land. James smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Good morning, Thomas. Ready for another long day?" Thomas grinned. "Always, James." What happened with Samuel? James explained the morning's conversation, omitting none of the tension, but emphasizing the importance of handling matters with respect and honesty. Thomas listened carefully, absorbing the lessons in leadership, patience, and moral strength. The frontier demanded these qualities, and James knew that his younger brother would one day need to navigate similar challenges. After breakfast, the brothers worked together to repair fences and feed the cattle. Their movements were efficient and practiced, a rhythm learned through years of shared labor. The tasks themselves were simple but essential, each one a small victory in maintaining their livelihood and protecting their family's legacy. While they worked, James's mind wandered back to the conversation with Samuel, replaying the gestures, the tone of voice, and the subtle signs of intention. Every detail mattered in understanding the man and the choices he would face in the days ahead. Later, a rider approached from the direction of the town, kicking up dust as he neared the ranch. James recognized the messenger, a young man named Daniel, who often delivered news, letters, and messages for the families of the plains. Daniel dismounted and handed James a folded piece of paper. "This just came from town," he said, his eyes curious. "It's for you." James unfolded the letter and read quickly. It was news of a severe storm approaching the region, one that could bring heavy rain and strong winds, threatening livestock and crops. The frontier was unpredictable, and weather could be as dangerous as any human rival. James felt a familiar knot of anxiety, but also a sense of resolve. He had faced storms before, and survived. The challenge would demand preparation, vigilance, and careful planning. He called Thomas and other ranch hands together, explaining the situation and organizing the necessary precautions. They secured the barns, reinforced fences, and moved vulnerable cattle to safer pastures. Every action was deliberate and purposeful, reflecting James's growing understanding of leadership and responsibility. The storm, though frightening, became a test of character as much as survival. It reminded James that honor on the frontier was not just about dealing with disputes, but also about protecting those under one's care and making choices that could save lives. As night fell, the storm arrived with a roar. Rain battered the land, wind tore at trees, and thunder shook the plains. James and his team worked tirelessly, guiding animals to shelter and checking the fences. The storm was relentless, a force beyond human control, yet it revealed the strength and resilience of those who lived on the frontier. Amid the chaos, James felt a deep connection to the land and to his people. Every choice mattered, and the consequences of action, or inaction, were immediate and visible. When the storm finally subsided, dawn revealed a landscape both damaged and renewed. Trees were uprooted, fences damaged, and small patches of pasture flooded. But the cattle were safe, and the ranch had survived. James surveyed the land with a mix of relief and pride. The storm had tested their skills, patience, and courage, and they had endured. It was a reminder that the frontier was not simply a place of survival, but a place where character was forged through adversity. In the following days, James focused on rebuilding and strengthening the ranch. He measured and repaired every fence, inspected each pasture, and tended to the animals with care. The experience with Samuel in the storm had deepened his understanding of honor and choice. Decisions were rarely easy, but they defined the man who made them. The frontier rewarded courage and punished recklessness, and James felt more certain than ever that he wanted to live with integrity, even when it required sacrifice. One afternoon, while checking a distant field, James noticed a figure in the distance. It was Samuel, approaching slowly, waving a hand. James rode to meet him, unsure of the visit's intent. Samuel stopped and nodded. "I wanted to thank you for handling things fairly," he said. "The storm tested us all, and your actions made a difference. I respect that." James nodded, recognizing the importance of reconciliation and respect on the frontier. We all had to act with care. That's what keeps the community strong. For the first time in a long while, a sense of understanding bridged the gap between the two men. The frontier was a place of conflict, yes, but also of cooperation, mutual respect, and the opportunity to rise above pride and stubbornness. Choices mattered, and the way they were made could shape the lives of everyone nearby. As James rode back home, he reflected on the lessons learned over the past week. The land demanded respect, the people required honesty, and the challenges, whether human or natural, were tests of character. Every action, every word, every decision had consequences that stretched beyond the individual. James understood that the frontier was a teacher like no other, shaping men and women with trials that revealed the true measure of their hearts. That evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, James sat on the porch with Thomas. They watched the cattle graze in the fading light, the air calm after days of storm and tension. James spoke softly, sharing the lessons of courage, responsibility, and the importance of honor. Thomas listened carefully, understanding that life on the frontier demanded more than strength. It demanded thoughtfulness, integrity, and the wisdom to make choices that reflected one's principles. The night settled over the plains, peaceful yet alive with the quiet sounds of nature. James felt a sense of readiness for whatever would come next. The frontier would continue to test him, and future challenges would demand every ounce of his courage, skill, and honor. But he knew that he was learning, growing, and preparing for the moments that would define his life. The choices he made and the honor he upheld would guide him through the turning points yet to come. The days that followed the storm were quieter, but they carried a weight all their own. The frontier had a way of reminding a man that peace was temporary, and challenges could arise at any moment. James Callahan spent long hours checking the ranch, ensuring the fences were repaired, the cattle fed, and the land carefully tended. The storm had been a test of strength, patience, and resilience, but it also offered a chance to reflect on the choices he had made. Each decision, no matter how small, shaped his life and the future of those around him. One morning, James rode out early, the sun barely breaking the horizon. He had noticed tracks near the far pasture, unfamiliar hoofprints that suggested another herd had wandered too close. The frontier was a place where even small surprises could bring great consequences. As he approached the fence, he spotted a man inspecting the land, on horseback. It was not Samuel this time, but a stranger, a rider from one of the nearby settlements. The man paused when he saw James, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning," the man called. "I'm Thomas Green. I just moved here and wanted to see who owns this land. I mean, no trouble." James studied the man carefully. Trust was earned, not given freely on the frontier. Every person carried a story and tensions hidden behind polite words. But James sensed honesty in Thomas's tone and posture. "I'm James Callahan," he replied. "This is our family ranch. You're welcome to look around, but please respect the boundaries." Thomas nodded, appreciating the balance between firmness and courtesy. "Of course. I just want to settle in and get along with my neighbors." James guided him briefly, showing the property, the barns, the grazing cattle, and the water sources. It was important for a man new to the area to understand the land, its limitations, and its potential. The frontier was full of opportunities, but it required hard work, patience, and respect for those who had already shaped the land with their labor and wisdom. After Thomas left, James reflected on the encounter. The frontier was changing. New settlers brought different ideas, skills, and ways of living. While some changes were welcome, others tested the traditions and codes that had guided families for generations. James felt the need to stay vigilant, to protect his family's legacy, while also learning to adapt to the evolving world around him. Choices were rarely simple here. They involved weighing honor, practicality, and the long-term effects of every action. Later that week, James received news from the town. A traveling merchant had seen signs of rustlers moving through the region. Rustlers were a constant threat on the frontier, men who stole livestock for profit and left destruction in their wake. James knew that protecting the ranch and community required careful preparation. He could not confront such dangers alone. His choices now had to consider not just his own safety, but the well-being of his family, neighbors, and the community as a whole. James called a meeting at the ranch with trusted neighbors, including Samuel Hayes. Despite their past disputes, both men understood the importance of cooperation when facing a common threat. The frontier demanded unity at times, even among those who were otherwise rivals. James spoke plainly, outlining the reports of rustlers and suggesting ways to safeguard their herds and property. "We need to act before they strike," he said. "Fences must be checked, animals kept close, and everyone must be ready to alert each other if something happens." Samuel listened carefully, nodding. "Agreed. I may not have always seen eye to eye with you, James, but this is bigger than any land dispute." The neighbors coordinated their efforts, sharing information, setting watch schedules, and reinforcing fences. Each decision carried weight. Missteps could cost lives or livelihoods. James felt the burden of leadership, but also the satisfaction of taking responsible action. It was in moments like these that the values of honor and courage were most tested. In the following days, the tension on the plains was palpable. Every rider on the horizon, every sound in the distance, set hearts racing. James patrolled the property with Dakota, his eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. The rustlers were cunning, and the frontier offered countless hiding places for those with ill intentions. Yet James remained calm, relying on observation, planning, and the strength of the community around him. He had learned that fear was not an enemy to be ignored, but a signal to stay alert and make careful choices. One afternoon, as James inspected the northern pasture, he noticed movement near the tree line. A group of figures appeared, cautious and deliberate, approaching the edge of the open land. James recognized the signs immediately. These were the rustlers mentioned in town. He felt a surge of concern, but also clarity. Decisions had to be made quickly, balancing risk with the safety of those under his care. James signaled to his neighbors and Samuel, who had stationed themselves at strategic points around the ranch. They worked quietly, ensuring the cattle were guided to safer areas while keeping watch for any aggressive movements. The rustlers seemed to hesitate, assessing the situation, aware that the Callahans and their allies were prepared. James knew that confrontation might be unavoidable, but he also understood the value of strategy and communication. The frontier was full of stories of men acting impulsively, only to face disastrous results. he chose to stay calm, to guide his community with reason and foresight. Every decision, every instruction, reflected his growing understanding of leadership and honor. As the day progressed, the rustlers eventually withdrew, discouraged by the preparedness and unity of the ranchers. James breathed a sigh of relief, but he knew this victory was temporary. The frontier was unpredictable, and new challenges would arise. The experience, however, reinforced his belief that careful, principled choices could protect not just property but lives, and preserve the dignity and honor of those involved. That evening, James returned home, tired but resolute. He found Thomas tending to the smaller animals, ensuring they had enough food and water. James watched his brother with pride. The younger man was learning the lessons of the frontier: hard work, responsibility, and the importance of careful decisions. James knew that his own choices had an impact beyond himself. The values he upheld, the actions he took would guide not just his life, but the lives of those around him, now and in the future. Later, as darkness fell and stars lit the sky, James reflected on the recent events. The storm, the boundary dispute, and the threat of rustlers had tested him in different ways. Each challenge had required him to make choices grounded in honor, responsibility, and foresight. The frontier was not just land. It was a proving ground for character, a place where courage, wisdom, and moral strength were measured every day. James sat on the porch, Dakota resting nearby, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought about the people he trusted, the family he protected, and the community he served. Every choice he made was a thread in the larger tapestry of life on the frontier. Mistakes could have far-reaching consequences, and successes carry their own responsibilities. The weight of these realities was not burdensome but instructive, shaping a man into someone capable of facing whatever turning points lay ahead. As the night deepened, the wind whispered through the plains, carrying the scent of distant fires, the faint cries of animals, and the quiet rustle of grass. James felt connected to the land, to his family, and to the traditions that had guided generations before him. He understood that every day brought opportunities to act with integrity, to uphold honor, and to make choices that reflected his values. These lessons were not abstract. They were lived, experienced, and tested in the reality of frontier life. Before retiring for the night, James checked the fences one last time and ensured the livestock were secure. The dangers of the frontier were ever present, but preparation, vigilance, and careful decision-making offered protection and peace of mind. James knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he felt ready. The experiences of the past weeks had strengthened him, clarified his purpose, and reinforced the importance of acting with honor, even when the path was difficult. He entered the house quietly, greeted by the warmth of the hearth and the familiar smells of home. Thomas was already asleep, but James paused a moment to look at the flickering fire. The frontier was a place of hardship and beauty, struggle and reward. It demanded much of those who lived there, but it also taught lessons that could not be learned anywhere else. James felt gratitude for the life he had chosen, the responsibilities he had embraced, and the community he helped protect. As sleep approached, James reflected one last time on the meaning of choice. Each day on the frontier offered a chance to demonstrate courage, uphold honor, and make decisions that mattered. These choices shaped not just the present, but the legacy left behind for future generations. James knew that the turning points of life would come, testing him in ways that were yet unknown. But he felt ready to face them, guided by experience, principle, and the unwavering belief that integrity and honor were the foundation of a meaningful life. The frontier had grown quiet after the storm and the brief threat of rustlers, but James knew that calm was never permanent. Life on the plains moved with subtle pressures, hidden dangers, and choices that tested a man in ways both large and small. The days were long, the sun harsh, and the work never-ending. Yet James felt a growing confidence in his ability to meet the challenges ahead. He had learned to read the land, understand people, and anticipate the consequences of his actions. One morning, while checking the northern fence, James noticed something unusual. The posts were disturbed in several places, and a few strands of wire had been bent. At first he thought it might have been caused by the recent storm, but the pattern seemed deliberate. His heart sank slightly. It was clear that someone had been near the property with intent. He scanned the horizon carefully, eyes sharp against the early light. There were tracks leading toward the distant hills, fresh and deliberate. James's mind raced with possibilities, and he realized that the frontier's turning point was arriving, the moment where careful preparation, honor, and decisive action would all be tested. James called Thomas over, speaking in low, deliberate tones. "Look here," he said, pointing to the fence. "Something's not right. We need to secure the property and make sure the animals are safe." Thomas examined the area, noting the tracks and disturbances. "Do you think it's rustlers again?" he asked. James nodded thoughtfully. "Could be, or it could be someone else testing our boundaries. Either way, we must act with care. Every move we make counts." The two brothers worked methodically, repairing the fence and reinforcing the gate. Every action was precise, reflecting lessons learned from the storm, the earlier disputes, and the responsibility of managing the ranch. James felt the weight of leadership heavily on his shoulders. Decisions on the frontier were rarely simple. They could affect property, safety, and even life itself. A single mistake could have far-reaching consequences. Later that day, James rode toward the town to gather information. The frontier was built on trust and knowledge, and staying informed was crucial. As he entered the general store, he noticed several familiar faces gathered near the fireplace. The conversation hushed slightly as he approached, eyes turning to him with quiet respect. James nodded to the men, exchanging greetings, and asked for news of any unusual activity in the region. A merchant spoke cautiously, describing sightings of strangers moving through the area, suspiciously close to multiple ranches.
"They don't seem to belong here," he said.
"People are worried. The plains have always tested us, but these strangers are testing something else." James listened carefully, absorbing every detail. The information confirmed his suspicions that the disturbances near his fence were deliberate. These strangers were probing, perhaps assessing weaknesses, perhaps considering mischief. On the frontier, subtle threats were as serious as obvious ones. A wise man measured every action, every word, and every consequence. Returning to the ranch, James gathered the trusted neighbors, including Samuel Hayes, to discuss a plan. Cooperation was critical now, even among men who had once argued over property lines. The frontier demanded unity in times of challenge. They agreed to patrol the area, secure livestock, and maintain clear communication in case of trouble. Every man understood that the actions they took now would determine the safety and stability of their community. The following days were tense. James patrolled the perimeter of the ranch daily, observing the land and watching for any sign of intrusion. Thomas worked alongside him, learning how to anticipate problems, respond to threats, and make careful decisions. The young man was beginning to understand the weight of responsibility and the importance of maintaining honor in every action. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, James noticed movement near the tree line. Shadows shifted among the sparse trees, and figures moved cautiously, testing the boundaries once again. James signaled to his neighbors, who had positioned themselves strategically. The situation required a delicate balance of vigilance and restraint. He could not act rashly, but he also could not ignore the approaching challenge. The strangers approached cautiously, clearly aware that they were being observed. James's heart beat steadily, and he reminded himself of the lessons learned over years of frontier life. Remain calm, think clearly, act with honor. This was the turning point, the moment where careful judgment would decide the outcome. James rode toward the figures slowly, hands visible, speaking in a firm but respectful tone. "You've crossed onto private property," he called out. "State your purpose." The strangers paused, recognizing the seriousness in his voice and the support from the surrounding neighbors. One of them stepped forward, explaining that they were travelers seeking work and passage through the area, claiming no intent to cause harm. James studied their faces, tone, and posture. Trust on the frontier had to be earned, but it could also be extended cautiously to prevent unnecessary conflict. After careful discussion, James decided to guide them to the town, ensuring they understood the boundaries and expectations. He emphasized the importance of respecting the land and the people who worked tirelessly to maintain it. The strangers nodded, understanding that their actions could have consequences, and they agreed to comply. Returning to the ranch, James reflected on the events of the day. The frontier tested every aspect of a person's character: courage, patience, judgment, and the ability to act with honor under pressure. Each decision carried weight, and the outcomes of these choices shaped not just individual lives, but entire communities. James understood that leadership meant making difficult decisions, often under uncertainty, and always with the welfare of others in mind. The days that followed involved rebuilding, reinforcing, and maintaining vigilance. James worked alongside his family and neighbors, repairing fences, tending to the animals, and reinforcing the ranch's defenses. Each action was deliberate, reflecting the lessons learned from past storms, disputes, and encounters. The work was demanding, both physically and mentally, but it strengthened the bonds between neighbors and family members, teaching the value of cooperation and shared responsibility. One afternoon, James rode out with Thomas to inspect the distant pastures. They discussed the events that had unfolded, reflecting on the importance of integrity, honor, and careful decision-making. James emphasized that every choice mattered, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. Thomas listened intently, realizing that life on the frontier demanded more than strength. It demanded wisdom, patience, and the courage to act rightly, even when decisions were difficult. As the sun began to set, James and Thomas noticed smoke rising in the distance. A small fire had started near a neighboring ranch, likely caused by lightning or a smoldering ember from a hearth. The fire spread quickly through the dry grass, threatening the property and livestock of nearby families. Without hesitation, James rode toward the danger, Thomas following closely. The neighbors quickly organized a firefighting effort, forming a human chain to move water from nearby sources and create fire breaks. The work was exhausting, but every action was crucial. Lives and livelihoods depended on their speed, coordination, and courage. James led calmly, directing the effort while ensuring that no one was put in unnecessary danger. The fire raged, but the combined effort of the community gradually brought it under control. By nightfall, the fire was contained. Damage was limited, and no lives were lost. The experience reinforced the importance of preparation, cooperation, and the courage to act decisively. James knew that life on the frontier was unpredictable, and every challenge, whether from nature or people, demanded integrity, leadership, and careful judgment. That evening, James sat on the porch, reflecting on the events of the past week. The storm, the boundary disputes, the rustlers, and the fire had all tested him in different ways. Each challenge required careful thought, moral courage, and the ability to act decisively for the good of the community. The frontier was a place where character was constantly revealed through actions, choices, and responses to unexpected events. James understood that the turning point of the frontier was not just a single event. It was a series of moments that tested a man's honor, courage, and wisdom. Every decision, every action, and every choice had consequences that could ripple through the community and shape the lives of those around him. He felt a sense of readiness, knowing that future challenges would come, but confident in the lessons he had learned and the strength he had gained. As night fell and stars filled the sky, James reflected on the values that guided him: integrity, responsibility, and honor. These were not abstract ideas. They were lived and tested daily on the frontier. He understood that every challenge, every choice, and every action shaped not just his own life, but the legacy he would leave behind. The turning point of the frontier was here, and he was prepared to face it with courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to what he knew was right. The days after the fire were quieter, but the lessons lingered. James Callahan walked through the ranch, observing the land with a careful eye. The grass had begun to recover from the scorch of the fire, and the fences, though repaired hastily during the emergency, still needed strengthening. Life on the frontier was rarely calm for long, but James had learned that every challenge carried a lesson, and every lesson shaped the man who faced it. James spent the morning checking the cattle, moving from pasture to pasture to ensure that none had strayed and that all were healthy. His brother Thomas followed closely, carrying tools and water. The younger man had grown much over the past weeks, learning to anticipate challenges and respond with thoughtfulness and care. James observed him with pride, knowing that the frontier demanded more than strength. It demanded wisdom, patience, and the courage to act rightly. By mid-morning, neighbors began to arrive. Samuel Hayes was among them, along with a few others who had helped during the fire and the rustler threats. James welcomed them warmly. The recent events had shown him that the frontier was a place of both hardship and community. Cooperation, trust, and honor were essential not just for survival, but for building lives that were meaningful and secure. As the men worked together to repair fences and check the livestock, James reflected on the choices he had made over the past weeks. The storm, the boundary dispute, the rustlers, and the fire had all been tests. Each had required careful thought, steady hands, and moral courage. The frontier did not allow for careless action or impulsive decisions. A man's honor was measured in the decisions he made, the risks he took to protect others, and the integrity he upheld, even when no one was watching. James called the group together during a short break. "We've been through a lot," he began. "The land, the weather, and the people here all test us. But we've seen that when we work together, when we act with honesty and courage, we can face whatever comes. That is what makes a community strong, and that is what makes a man respected." Samuel nodded in agreement. "I've learned that as well. Even when we disagree, we can find common ground when it matters most. That is what keeps us all safe and our work meaningful." The group resumed their work with renewed energy. Repairs were made carefully, animals were checked thoroughly, and the land began to feel steady again. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, a quiet pride that came from facing challenges together and overcoming them with skill, patience, and honor. James felt a deep connection to the people around him and to the land he had grown to love so fully. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, James and Thomas rode along the edge of the property. The plains stretched endlessly before them, glowing gold in the last light of day. James spoke softly, sharing his reflections with his brother.
"Every challenge we face shakes us, Thomas.
It's not just about surviving or protecting what we own. It's about making choices that reflect who we are, and about showing honor in everything we do." Thomas nodded, taking in every word. "I understand, James. It's more than just work. It's about how we live, how we treat others, and how we make decisions even when it's hard." James smiled, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Exactly. The frontier teaches us these things. It shows us the value of responsibility, courage, and respect. It teaches that our choices matter, not just to us, but to everyone around us." As night fell, the Callahans gathered around the hearth in their home. The fire crackled warmly, and the smell of cooking filled the room. The family shared stories, laughter, and reflections on the past weeks. Life on the frontier was not easy, but it was meaningful. Every hardship, every decision, and every victory carried lessons that shaped character and guided future actions. James thought about the strangers who had passed through his land, the rustlers who had tested the community, and the fire that had threatened their livelihoods. Each challenge had demanded patience, observation, and courage. Each had reminded him that the frontier was a place of constant testing, where a man's honor and the wisdom of his choices determined the well-being of those he cared for. In the following days, life began to return to a steady rhythm. Fences were fully repaired, pastures restored, and livestock secured. James spent time teaching Thomas more advanced skills: how to read the land, track animals, and anticipate challenges before they became emergencies. He shared stories of past generations, explaining how his father and grandfather had faced similar trials, each one shaping the family's legacy and instilling the values that guided them. James also took time to connect with the neighbors. Samuel Hayes, once a rival, had become a trusted ally in recent weeks. Their collaboration had strengthened not only the ranches but also the bonds within the community. The frontier demanded respect, but it also rewarded integrity, cooperation, and wisdom. James saw that leadership was not about asserting dominance, but about guiding others with fairness and courage. One afternoon, James and Thomas rode to the far pasture, stopping at a hill that overlooked the entire ranch. The sun was high, casting long shadows over the plains. James gestured toward the land, his voice quiet but firm. "This is our life, Thomas. Every choice we make affects it. Every decision shows who we are. Remember that. Always. The frontier will test you, but it will also teach you the lessons you need to live with honor." Thomas listened intently, understanding the gravity of his brother's words. The frontier was not simply a place to live. It was a place to learn, to grow, and to become the man a person was meant to be. Every day brought challenges, but also opportunities to demonstrate courage, wisdom, and integrity.
As the sun began to set, James thought about the turning points of the past weeks.
The storms, the boundary disputes, the rustlers, and the fire had all tested him in different ways. Yet he had emerged stronger, more confident in his abilities, and more certain of the principles that guided his life. Honor, courage, and careful choice were not abstract concepts. They were practical tools that allowed a man to protect his family, his community, and himself. That evening, as the stars appeared in the clear night sky, James felt a sense of peace. The frontier would continue to present challenges, but he was prepared. His choices had shaped the land and the lives around him in meaningful ways. The lessons learned would guide not just him, but the next generation, ensuring that honor and responsibility remained central to life on the plains. James reflected on the future. The frontier was always changing, with new settlers, new challenges, and new opportunities. But some things remained constant: the value of integrity, the importance of careful decision-making, and the need to act with courage and fairness. These principles had guided his family for generations and would continue to do so. He thought of Thomas, growing stronger and wiser with each passing day, and of the neighbors who had come together to face adversity. The frontier was a place of struggle, but also of community, learning, and growth. James knew that the choices he made now would ripple forward, shaping the land and people for years to come. As the night deepened, James stood outside for a moment, gazing at the vast expanse of land under the stars. He felt a deep connection to the plains, to the family he protected, and to the values that guided him. Life on the frontier demanded much, but it also gave much in return: a sense of purpose, a chance to grow, and the satisfaction of acting with honor. James understood that the turning points of life often came quietly, in the form of decisions that carried consequences far beyond what could be seen in the moment. Storms, disputes, and emergencies were all tests, each revealing character and guiding the path forward. He had faced these tests and emerged stronger, more thoughtful, and more certain of his principles. Finally, James returned inside, closing the door to the cool night air. The warmth of the hearth welcomed him, and the quiet comfort of home reminded him why he worked so hard to maintain the land, protect his family, and uphold his honor. The frontier had tested him, taught him, and strengthened him, and he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He looked at Thomas, now asleep, and smiled. The future was uncertain, as it always would be on the frontier, but the lessons of honor, careful choice, and courage would guide them both. James knew that the decisions made in these formative weeks would echo through the years, shaping the legacy of the Callahans and the community they called home. As the fire crackled and the night embraced the land, James felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The frontier had been harsh, demanding, and unpredictable, but it had also given him purpose, taught him wisdom, and allowed him to act with integrity. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he was confident that honor, careful choice, and courage would see him through. The stars shone brightly over the plains, a silent witness to the resilience, strength, and wisdom of those who lived upon them. James knew that the legacy of the frontier was not measured in wealth or power, but in the character of the men and women who chose to face it with honor, make difficult choices, and act with courage. He felt proud to be one of them, and grateful for the lessons that life on the frontier had given him.